What is the worst Uber Pokemon? By False Swipe Gaming.
Ubers is home to the Pokemon that are too powerful for standard play. They are banished so as to allow a balanced metagame not plagued by the imbalance of Mewtwo and its ilk. Of course, since many players want to play with Mewtwo, Ubers becomes more than a ban list. It becomes a metagame of its own. Turns out there's a balance to be found in the chaos of clashing broken monsters. This balance has become so valued that several Pokemon even found themselves banned from Ubers for the sake of the tier's competitiveness, which was previously unthinkable. However, not every Pokemon too strong for OU is worthwhile in Ubers, and they simply languish there without usage. We're not just talking about things like Gen 8 Cinderace, which are too strong and fast for OU, yet definitely can't match the standard of Kyogre and friends. We're talking the more obvious immediate Ubers, the big legendaries with enormous stats. In many cases, the things from the game's box art. Some of these can be downright useless in Ubers, even if they seem impressive, and are still too much for OU. So today we're examining the Pokemon that are Uber in name only, and not at all in the actual metagame effect. Join us in exploring some of the worst Uber Pokemon.
So I actually like that intro. Pretty short and snappy 1 minute intro on that. I think the music was a little too loud. I'd have to have somebody on like mobile or like tablet or speakers even, because through headphones it felt like he was conflicting with the background music for a little bit. Not necessarily a dig, it's more of like a criticism, if you will. No, I liked it. I also like that it's, top 10 list status effectively. And so for those that are not aware of Smogon, think of it effectively like a unified fan format of the game. So when I play, when I want to play competitive Pokemon, right, I'm playing Pokemon VGC. That's official, like Pokemon company, like Nintendo status. Like you show up to events and you play the like doubles format. You play VGC. Smogon it has its own ban list. There are clauses like sleep clause. You can't put more than one Pokemon to sleep. There are definitely tiers in format. You don't necessarily want something like an Umbreon going up against like a Choice Specs Water Spout Kyogre, right? Like you can, especially in Ubers, but that's you have different tiers to help balancing out. You'll have people who will say, anything under like OU is just unplayable. Definitely a lot of opinions get thrown around in that aspect, but anytime you hear OU Ubers, Smogon, think of it like the like competitive quote unquote like unified Pokemon fan format that does include things like doubles, that does include singles, a lot of singles. Competitive singles, I think, is strictly Smogon because we don't really have a singles VGC variant. I don't know if triple and multi battles, those are kind of a gimmick for a couple generations, right? Like 5 and 6, right? Those were kind of gimmicky. I don't know if those are supported. I'm pretty sure things like Battle Royale from Gen 7 aren't supported either.
But before we start, this video is sponsored by Factor. If you're anything like us at FSG, you probably lead a very busy life, whether it be work or other obligations. Who has time to add further stress to your day prepping, cooking, and cleaning when it comes to your food? And takeout is too expensive. Why not enjoy your food stress-free by ordering a box from Factor? All of Factor's meals are chef-crafted, dietitian-approved, and come from a weekly menu of 35 options. They are pre-cooked and ready to eat right out the microwave after just 2 minutes. They may be pre-cooked, but they are never frozen, so they are way better than frozen TV dinners. In fact, Factor was kind enough to send us a keto box, which have all sorts of low-carb meals that are delicious. I especially love this ground beef and thyme cottage pie, and this pork tenderloin with cheesy cabbage. Man, that was really good. But keto isn't their only option. You get to choose from a bunch of different meal plans from Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and of course, Veggie and Vegan. But that's not all. Factor now has loads of snack options including breakfast, protein shake lattes, juices, and even these new mango smoothies with zero added sugars. I love mango smoothies. How did Factor know? And the best part, it's way cheaper than eating takeout. Don't fall into the overpriced takeout trap. With Factor, you get the convenience of takeout as it's delivered straight to your door, but at a much more affordable price. So what are you waiting for? Eat stress-free. Head to factor75.com or click the link in the description below and use code 50FalseSwipe to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50FalseSwipe at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box.
I'd give it a 7 out of 10. I think that especially in the back, like third, I think the audio was starting to conflict. I can't tell. I mean, it could just be my audio drivers. It could be something. Occasionally, my audio drivers will go through a thing where, like, I'll start hearing like like not necessarily static, but like you hear like shh, and then everything just becomes like a garbled mess. I don't think that's what's happening here specifically. I think the audio might be peaking at a couple points. But in regards to, I mean, ad read, that was a solid, what? We're looking at about, minute and a half ad read, a little long. Advertisers do have things that they require. They have certain lengths they require. Sometimes even you'll have creators like Simon Whistler on The Blaze, who allegedly... who'll do like entire like 5-minute ad reads. But I mean, there are advertiser requirements. I totally get that. I've kind of been like QR pilled, if that makes sense. Any use of QR, like the footage made sense. That case though, whatever that case is, I want that was a pretty spicy PC case that he had. Footage was relevant. Footage looked good. Things like the microwave flashing, the numbers, a couple things like the pouring of drink. Right. I mean, like the photography is good. But things made sense, right? It's not like, inappropriate footage. Does this necessarily match the source material? I would say so, right? It was justified. Hi, if you do some editing or better Pokemon play, you should do this thing, right? I think it made sense. I think that a couple things like QR codes could have made it better. I don't think it was super cluttered. Like the cuts were minimalistic and effective. I'd give it a 7 out of 10. If it was my audio driver issue specifically, and there's like no issue with audios that other people are hearing, even with like audiophile headphones like Sennheisers and stuff, then I would give it an 8 out of 10. For me, it felt like there was a little bit of audio conflict, but that's don't treat this like an attack. It's just critiques. It's just criticism, right? In the specific like constructive criticism and critique format. Like I liked it. I thought it was a good ad read. Really? Normal form, yeah.
Deoxys Normal, or DON, is by far the worst of the Deoxys forms. Not because it's nondescript, no. That would actually be preferable. A Deoxys form with more neutral stats across the board would give it its own unique niche. No, DON fails because it is a lesser version of Deoxys Attack. DOA is an extreme type of Pokemon, and if you're going to go extreme, you have to commit. DOA's design commits fully. No pretenses towards any bulk whatsoever. Just all-out destruction through offense and speed. DON commits too, just not as much. It's clear why this doesn't work. When you pull back even just a little, you don't get the full effect. Okay, DON gets a little extra bulk in exchange for not being as strong and fast as DOA. Does that extra bulk actually do anything? No, it doesn't. Well, since we're suckers for detail, not really, meaning that no, it has never done anything except for this one instance a long time ago. In Gen 4 Ubers, DON had a very specific niche in the lead metagame, which of course is centered around Deoxys speed. Basically, DON's job was to act as a DOA that had just enough bulk to withstand hits from DOS, preventing it from getting anti-lead, and being able to carry out its own anti-leading as DOA would like to do itself, were it not so tremendously vulnerable to DOS's extreme speed. However,
so this is actually the theory behind complex EV spreads. So when you're talking about EV spreads, right? I mean, generally you're going to see, I would argue, more often than not, you're arguing something that's going to be like 252, 254, 4, 252, well, technically 6, right? But EVs only work in factors of 4. Or you have something like 252, well, in older generations, wasn't it like 252, 252, 8? I think a couple EVs got lost along the way there. It's been a while since I've actually looked at like the EV changes throughout the generations. But that's the actual like philosophy that goes into complex EV spreads, right? So if you see like, I don't know, like a Koraidon with like, I think mine's currently running like 220 HP, 252 attack. No, 252 speed, 220 HP, and then like 32. Yeah, like 32 attack. That's very specifically to live certain hits. Or if you see something like, I don't know, let's say someone has a Weavile with like 252 speed and like 184 attack and like the rest is chunked into HP or something like that. Like they're doing something specific. They're doing something to generate live hits. They're trying to exceed certain thresholds. So let's say on a high roll, like, I don't know, Deoxys speed, extreme speed. I don't remember. I don't know where to pull up the calc right now, right? But let's say Deoxys speed form, extreme speed does something along the lines of like 300 damage, right? Neutral, right? And you're like, okay, well, I need to be able to live this. Or alternatively, you're trying to gain certain thresholds with like substitute, right? Because substitute is a quarter of your HP. This is all from memory. I don't have anything pulled up right now. So generally, you can only get off so many substitutes in the game, or if you're running something like, I don't know, like my Iron Hands variant for raids, right, for Terra raids, how I use Belly Drum or even Snorlax in a competitive sense in VGC, like uses certain EV spreads to be able to use the Belly Drum to be able to proc the berry or to proc any sort of item like, you know, citrus berry, specific nature berries, etc., to regain health. Because if your spread isn't correct, you will have your HP, but you will not be in the territory where your berry actually procs, and then you're just kind of a sitting duck. So I like that this was used. I think this is before Team Lead. I think Team Lead preview was 5, if I remember correctly. I don't think it was in 4. Yeah, I think Team Preview was introduced in Black and White. Think is the keyword. But this is the philosophy that goes into complex EV spreads, and just understanding your metagame. If Deoxys speed form it is a dominant force in the metagame, you have to, 1, deal with it, but 2, you have to make sure that you have some way to counter or check it to be able to play the game, or else it just sweeps you GG, right?
Over time, DOS moved away from extreme speed in favor of more useful moves, and even beyond that, players just wanted to use DOA, which was so much better in literally every other situation, including against bulkier DOS, which were more capable of taking DON's hits. It's not like DON was weak by any stretch of the imagination. Base 150 offenses is the same as Rayquaza after all, and the move pool is of course excellent, but there is a massive gulf between those offenses, impressive as they are, and the over-the-top twin base 180s of DOA. If you really wanted extra bulk while remaining fast, you are best off just using DOS itself, whose base 90 defenses absolutely towered over DON's base 50. Sure, it didn't hit as hard, but it would give you far more functional utility for your efforts. Even the oft-overlooked Deoxys defense had more of a niche. It wasn't a great wall against the high-powered Ubers metagame, but it leveraged its superb natural bulk to far greater utility than DON as well. After Gen 4, nobody ever paid DON a single thought. It didn't even last in Gen 4 after all, and the competition only grew more stringent as time went on. It is pure and simply worse in all respects than Deoxys attack. It'd be like using Gabite instead of Garchomp, except worse because at least with Gabite, you know you're using something entirely inferior. With DON, you might be fooled into thinking its extra bulk will actually do something for you. We exaggerate, obviously. Of course, DON isn't the same thing as Gabite because in its own right, DON is a great Pokemon. It's not like you get into a battle and it does nothing. If you did that with Gabite, you'd have the floor mopped with you. DON can still have use. It's just bad because it is unequivocally outclassed and not by a narrow margin either. DOA dwarfs it in utility. If DON had a more balanced stat spread, it could take on a truly unique niche of its own. Bulk greater than DOS, speed greater than DOD, and of course, hitting harder than both of them. But alas.
I think that's an interesting thing to really dive into, where, I mean, me personally, I've never really seen the validity in using something like Deoxys normal form, because I mean, back in Fire Red, right, Birth Island, Naval Rock, that status, right, the mystery defense that Deoxys was locked behind, attack and defense were actually dependent on version. I think speed was Emerald, right? I think attack, what is it? Attack is Fire Red, defense is Leaf Green. I think speed was locked behind Emerald. I don't know where normal fell in. Thus we get into things like Gen 4, where you can use meteorites to be able to change forms and stuff like that, right? Diamond and Pearl. Whatever the fighting gym is. It's been so long since I've gone through. I say that, but I played through Brilliant Diamond, Shining Pearl, like when it came out, and I always forget the name of like cities in not Hoenn. Wow, Hoenn's Gen 3 in Sinnoh. I always forget Sinnoh names. But I mean, it's I think Deoxys is kind of a product of its time, where in modernity, we have some hyper-optimized Pokemon, right? As for all intents and purposes. We'll have things like Fluttermane floating around. We had things like Zacian. We have Zamazenta. That wasn't necessarily doing things in comparison to Zacian in Sword and Shield, but then going into Scarlet and Violet, I guess Zamazenta was a very big threat at one point. It still probably is. So it's interesting to see how when games change, certain Pokemon will shift in terms of usage, depending on what isn't available. In regards to pronunciation as well, I really don't have a leg to stand. I know he said Thyme earlier on in the video. I don't have a room to stand on. I say Rayquaza, and I say Eternatus. Someone pointed out, like, what do you mean Eternatus? Isn't it Eternatus? I'm like, that would make a lot more sense. But my brain has just, I've no ground to stand on when it comes to pronunciations. Deoxys Normal is just interesting. I didn't really see the value in it. I'm also more of an offensive player. I'll rely on type synergies to try and threshold certain hits. So, for example, Lando T, right? I don't want to have anything that can super effective hit Lando T. and then I just effectively eat hits, right? And if I really want to hyper optimize, like maybe I'll just go, okay, well maybe I'll just run more of like a support set with Lando T. Maybe I'll have something like Assault Vest. I'll put I don't know, like 200 and 252 into HP or something like that. Bulk it up a little bit more, right? That's my personal play style though, and yours absolutely could differ. But it always seemed better to kind of just close out the game with something like speed to set up in what capacity it could and try to cheese out some cheeky KOs. Attack to be able just to go ham. Defense did have a specific niche in regards to stall because, I mean, it got access to like what Spikes has a lot of defensive stats. But then you run into the philosophy of if your opponent's knocked out, you don't have to take damage, right? And I think that there are absolutely some defensive powerhouses. Like look at Among Us, right? Like Among Us shows up in a lot of metagames. You definitely have some defensive Pokemon out there. But if you can cheese those KOs, I think that it's a very aggressive and high power metagame. At least higher tiers. Yeah.
Solgaleo's greatest contribution to Ubers is its fusion with Necrozma, giving us Duskmane, which is basically a Mega Solgaleo, which ensures that Solgaleo itself has no reason to be used. Even if you take away the fact that in Gen 7, this Mega Solgaleo can also turn into another Mega Pokemon entirely. However, even before Ultra Sun and Moon came around, Solgaleo had almost no presence in Gen 7 Ubers, after a small handful of uses early in the gen where New Toy Syndrome was in full effect, and even that wore off quite quickly, especially considering its box legend status. Eventually, opinions of its capability dropped to the point where it was suggested to be tested in OU. That didn't come close to actually happening, but even those who disagreed with it found it difficult to fully dispute the fact that the idea had some legitimacy to it, even if not altogether that much. Put it this way, someone suggests Mewtwo for OU, you look at them like a maniac. Someone suggests Solgaleo for OU and, well, you might not agree, but you could see it. What is Solgaleo's issue then? Well, it's quite comparable to Metagross, which it shares not only its typing and therefore stab combination with, but also a near identical attack stat. Its base 137 clocking in at slightly higher than Meta's base 135. And even its ability. Yes, Solgaleo's is called Full Metal Body, but it is identical to the stat drop blocking Clear Body that Metagross most enjoys for the fact that it prevents the ubiquitous physical attacker catch-all of Intimidate from slowing it down whatsoever. With this comparison in mind, the idea's credibility is suddenly thrust into sharp new clarity. For all its power, Metagross's offensive threat level is not what it once was, as demonstrated by its decline over the generations. Steel may have improved as a stab with the introduction of fairy types, but it's still not incredible in its own right without a helpful secondary stab, and Psychic doesn't quite gel well as you'd like, nor do its coverage moves. While useful, they just don't pack the kind of shattering power you need. We're not talking Mega Metagross here, of course. Mega Metagross is much faster than Solgaleo, and significantly stronger too, with its higher base attack bolstered further by its Tough Claws ability. In fact, it outclasses it so significantly that Mega Metagross was actually a fairly common sight, far more than Solgaleo in the Sun and Moon metagame, before Duskmane was to arrive in the Ultra Sun and Moon. Of course, the reason Solgaleo isn't dropped into OU is that it's not just a better Metagross, it is a much better Metagross. It's far faster, far bulkier on both sides of the spectrum, and has an amazing coverage move in Flare Blitz. It can even heal itself reliably with Morning Sun. Still, it demonstrates why Solgaleo wasn't used in Ubers even pre-Duskmane. The concepts holding Metagross back through multiple generations of OU held true in Ubers as well, and Solgaleo just could not make much of an impact in a metagame dominated by fast, bulky Arceus forms as well as Primal Groudon. Its stab Sunsteel Strike wasn't going to get it very far. Doesn't Duskmane have the same issues? Theoretically, yes, but it's not held back by them because it is much stronger and can boost further with Swords Dance, and is more difficult to take down with super effective hits thanks to Prism Armor. It's better on the support side too, thanks to its access to Stealth Rock, but again, even pre-Duskmane, Solgaleo offered nothing even defensively that wasn't done much better by Magearna, which made up for its lack of reliable recovery with its far better defensive typing and access to Heal Bell. Even the unique concept of Scarf Solgaleo didn't really generate much enthusiasm in those early Gen 7 days. If it was ruined by the addition of Duskmane, that'd be one thing, but Solgaleo just couldn't hack it from the very beginning.
I think that that's super interesting to think about. I mean, yeah, and for all intents and purposes, I mean, we can see Reshiram up on the screen. I think that the black and white legendaries, Reshiram and Zekrom, run into the similar issue where if you have something like Kyurem Right and Kyurem Black in the format, why on earth would you ever run Reshiram or Zekrom? So if you have, I don't know, Lunala and Solgaleo in format, but they both like take that special Pokemon clause, right? Like they take that like special Pokemon slot on your team, which, you know, things like in VGC, special Pokemon are things like, Solgaleo, Necrozma, Mewtwo, Kyogre, etc. Like your legendary slot for all intents and purposes. Yeah, like why would you just not run the strictly better version? Why would you not run Duskmane? Which that comes down to like not all Pokemon are created equal competitively. There are definitely Pokemon that are better, and I mean, arguably in game design, you do need things that are better versus things that are just worse, right? If you crack open a game of insert TCG here, yeah, you're gonna have your chase cards, right? In Pokemon, you're gonna have, you know, like Dragapult EX, right? That are just gonna be, you know, meta staples. In Magic the Gathering, you're gonna have things like Ragavan, right, which become in its standard day was a 4 of that you spent $200 a copy on, right? But for every Ragavan and Dragapult that you run into, for every Fiendsmith and Yu-Gi-Oh you run into, like you run into the bottom of the barrel, like not necessarily Pauper, right? But you have like, you know, mythics, double rares, secret rares, etc. that are just bad, right? For every, you know, 1 red mana do 3 damage, you have 2 red mana do 1 damage, right? Because not everything is necessarily geared towards the highest of play. It's okay to have things that are less powerful and things that are more powerful. I think that being able to accentuate, because everything goes in different strategies, right? Because if we were looking at strictly just like, okay, well, let's look at modern competitive Pokemon, just make everything hyper fast, make everything hyper aggressive, right? Like Zacian, I almost said Zacian EX, like Zacian Crown status, right? But I mean, then you run into things like, where does your Cresselia fall in? Where does your niche picks like, you know, Pachirisu come in, right? Pachirisu obviously being Pichu mascot for Gen 4, but like you do need things that are just inherently less good. And even then, that's how you can get pauper formats and trading card games where it's just like, oh yeah, no, this is a 1 red damage, 1 red mana, 1 damage in Magic the Gathering. And sure, you could probably use that in something like Pauper, or like 1 red for 2 damage, right? You're not necessarily having to pay a 1 red for 3 that could be in like mythic status, right? That's just diversity of play, things like that. It's interesting to look at it from a better metagrow standpoint. I also realized, like, I've spared at Primal Groudon's model way too much because so many details on this, so cool, like its eyes. And then I realized we don't actually have a Switch version with the updated HD textures on that, so that's actually really interesting to think about. I kind of want Mega Evolution back. I think competitively it'd be very interesting, but I don't know if a lot of people necessarily want Megas back. Yeah, comparing it to just an Uber's Metagross, I think is great. Obviously, it has stats over Metagross. Obviously, it has the same typing, right? Where you have things like Dracovish, which is just non-Uber Palkia. They fulfill different niches, right? But the typing's the same, right? Duraludon, Archaludon, which is just Dialga. Dragapult, which is just Giratina, right? Like, I mean, we refer to things by their typing effectively. So this is just Uber Metagross. It's interesting to think about. Mega Metagross surpasses it, so you can run Mega Metagross as your slot team. You could also run, if Duskmane is in the format, why are you just not running Duskmane Necrozma, right? Like, why would you be running why would you be running a card that says, like, I don't know, like 3 red mana, do 10 damage? Why would you run a card that says like pay 3 red mana, do 6 damage when you could run like pay 3 mana and do like 8 damage, right? Like for the same thing in a vacuum, these are the same. Like why would you not just run 3 for 5 instead of 3 for 3, right? So we start running into conversations like that. I don't dislike Solgaleo by any means. I think that it just definitely underperforms, and that's why I think you could have, like, especially on the VGC side of things, right? Like, because you have like Pokemon that are excluded, right? So like when the generation starts out, you don't have access to like a bunch of legendaries and stuff, right? Like maybe you have access to, like, I know early Scarlet and Violet had a bunch of like Golden Go and stuff, but I don't really think that like you start diving into like the legendaries until later on, right? I mean, for like Gen 7, Sun and Moon, Ultra Sun, Ultra Moon, you had your Alola decks, and so you reached out to like the national decks, then you reached out to like Ubers and stuff like that, right? You have that clear like power progression as the format continues. So it's just interesting to think about, right? It's interesting to be able to look at and understand that, you know, this is box legendary status, but it doesn't quite put in the work. VGC wise, you could just see, hi, you may use certain special Pokemon, right? Like things like Solgaleo, Reshiram, etc. But you can't use things like Dustmane Necrozma. You may not use things like Black and White Cure. I think that there's some like leeway to be able to like have ban lists where you can run hyper powerful Pokemon. Like you can run Uber status Metagross and Solgaleo, but without necessarily introducing the entirety of like the Uber's quote unquote metagame. Like I think that there's potential there. There are definitely people who played Smogon and VGC far more than I have who'd be able to really dive into this in a much deeper capacity than I can.
When Reshiram first hit the scene in Generation 5, everyone was excited, not just because it was one of the box legends, but because of its amazing offensive potential that seemed to take several of the most dangerous aspects of the game and slam them together for absurd destruction. Its base 150 special attack and base 90 speed were par for the course, but what stood out was its stab combination. It had that stab Draco Meteor that was all the rage in those days, resisted only by seals and packing a whopping base 140 base power, as opposed to the toned down base 130 that it would become in Gen 6 and later.
Yeah.
It also had Ferocious Fire Stab, nearly as powerful in Blue Flare, which would actually become much stronger thanks to the boost from the tier-defining Groudon's Perpetual Sun, and which had greater super effective coverage to boot. Additionally, the two made a terrific combination beyond simply giving us the Dragon Fire type that we've been dreaming of since we first saw Charizard. They complemented each other wonderfully, as the steals that resisted Draco Meteor wouldn't want to come anywhere near Reshiram's nuclear meltdown of a sunny Blue Flare. And the opposite was also true for bulky Fire Resist, trying to slow down the latter. There was no resist to the combination of the two, not even Heatran, as Reshiram's Turbo Blaze rather than ignite Heatran's Flash Fire bulldozed it entirely, leaving it merely as another.
Right, because it's right. Yeah. It's Scrappy, right? Or like Hypercutter, right? Where it just completely just like bowls through effects.
Victim to be reduced to ash by Blue Flare. Even the pink blobs Chansey and Blissey couldn't stand up to Blue Flare's unholy screaming power. You couldn't even try to replace the sun against Reshiram safely, given how badly Draco Meteor bludgeoned Kyogre and Tyranitar. Everyone was thrilled at the prospect of what promised to be Ubers' new foremost architect of annihilation. But that didn't last long at all. You might think, oh, Reshiram was eclipsed by Cure and White when Black and White 2 came around. And yes, that was more or less true, but before that, Reshiram had already been tossed aside, not a part of serious play after the initial appeal had worn off. It lasted longer than Solgaleo. It hit much harder after all, but it was simply such an unbelievable pain to safely get it on the field that the player base quickly lost patience and stopped bothering. It was
okay, so this is the concept of like escort the payload, but getting it in is kind of a pain. Like I guess in like Yu-Gi-Oh, right? It would be the like, what's a good like comparison? Like Rainbow Dragon, right? Like, cool, you have to have 7 or more Crystal Beast monsters on your like on your field or graveyard, right? And then you're able to like drop Rainbow Dragon, but Rainbow Dragon doesn't have any protections, right? Like it doesn't have this card is immune to like effects, immune to targeting, etc. It has no protections. So sure, grats, you dropped you've dropped Rainbow Dragon on board. Sucks when they can just bottomless trap hole it, right? I mean, obviously, like I'm sure there's more modern examples you could think of, right? Like hyper powerful requires a lot of finagling to get it on board. I guess from Magic's perspective, because I play Tron in Magic, right? Even when I play Magic, I don't play Magic correctly because I play modern Tron. It's like Emrakul, right? So even in Tron, like at a competitive standpoint, I don't run Emrakul Aeon's Torn because something 15 mana. Like, even if I wanted to, like, go deep on it, it is still 1 mana. If it was 14 mana, I'd be fine with it. But the fact that it's that 15, it thresholds it in a certain way. Because Tron is 1 + 1 + 1 = 7, right? It's a 2, 2, and 3 split, right? So, you know, I go something like 7, Karn Liberated. I can go another Tower, which is 10, Ulamog, Ceaseless Hunger. I can do things like that. But, like, even if I get a second playset, so I have 2 Mine, 2 Power Plant, and 2 Tower, right? I only hit 14. I hit Promised End, but I don't hit something like Karn Liberated. I just don't threshold correctly, which is a big thing because it's not only are games that you have to further your own game state in Pokemon, knocking out more of your opponent's Pokemon so that they can't play the game anymore, right? Like, not only do you have to focus on furthering your own game state, you have to be cognizant of what your opponent's doing, right? Like, if like the funny Magic the Gathering meme, what happens if my opponent just like something 15 or 15 1/1 flying squirrels, right? Like, sure. Or alternatively, like they can just like counterplays, destroy lands, etc. Like what happens if it's like, okay, cool. Well, I have 14. I'm going to drop a tower. Okay. Response, some sort of like instant speed, cool, destroy that land. I don't know how prevalent land destruction. That's one of the things Magic doesn't really like doing. They exist. But even then throughout, let's say I'm about to hit like, you know, I'm one tower off, so I'm at like 13 or so, something like that, right? And then opponent's turn, they drop something like waste to be able to just like destroy the land, right? Like I have to be cognizant of how my opponent's playing. In Yu-Gi-Oh, that's fine. I can solitaire out Yubel, but I have to be cognizant of, okay, have they dropped their Ash Blossom? If we're playing Master Duel, have they dropped their Max C yet? Okay, no. What are they dropping? Oh, well, they're just gonna lock me out of the games with fairies this game. This is gonna be fun. Like I have to be cognizant of like you have to be cognizant of how to play. But it's a balancing act, because if you're too concerned with what your opponent's doing, it becomes super reactive. But if you're too concerned with what you're doing, you can kind of like horse blinders yourself into not progressing your game state.
Legitimately easier to get Ho-Oh on the field, Stealth Rock weakness and all, because Ho-Oh had much better bulk and the typing to actually switch into common threats safely, such as several dangerous Arceus forms like Fighting. And remember, this is before Black and White 2, meaning before Ho-Oh got Regenerator. Once it was on the field, right, Ho-Oh was functional.
I forget it gets Regenerator. I need to check into that, because I have a shiny Ho-Oh that I got in the raid dens in Sword and Shield.
Just as adept at blazing its way through neutral targets with Sunny Sacred Fires, crippling even resist with the burns, so Tyranitar wouldn't exactly jump at the prospect of replacing Sun with Sand, while also delighting in brave birding the lights out of Kyogre attempting to replace Sun with Rain. Reshiram, on the other hand, wasn't outright frail, but it was a far cry from bulky by Uber standards, which combined with its far less useful defensive typing meant getting it on the field was a major struggle. This severely impeded its ability to launch its Blue Flares and Draco Meteors. Conversely, despite its lower power, Ho-Oh's superior defensive profile gave it so many more opportunities that it wound up dealing much more damage over time. However, it wasn't just a matter of being outclassed. Even if Ho-Oh was randomly yeeted out of existence, Reshiram still would have been a failure because of how all-encompassing its flaws were. The complete lack of defensive utility didn't just make team building with it more difficult, it prevented it from delivering on its promise of scorched earth offense. Ubers was just too fast-paced. You better be able to match that pace or slow the game down if you want to succeed. Even if your power is crazy even by its high standards, never forget the Reshiram-Pardos theorem. Time wasn't kind to it at all either. The removal of Permanent Sun, the nerf to Draco Meteor base power, and of course the addition of fairy types like Xerneas, as well as the usual dose of power creep, ensured Reshiram was just as useless in subsequent generations. It became one of the poster Pokemon for Ubers that weren't actually good in Ubers, which of course is what this video is all about.
I think it was actually super interesting because I was going to bring it up. The fact that he brought up the Reshiram theory, right? Or sorry, not the Reshiram, the Rampardos theory, because that's what it is, right? Like, and I've inherently run into the concept time and time again in games. I remember Yu-Gi-Oh! I was playing in Legacy of the Valiant format, so we had like things like Bujin running around, certain Gladiator Beast decks were running around. Silent Honor Arc, Exoton Knight were the new cards, right? I remember playing that, and I was playing like Grinder Golem jank is how I'm going to word that. Like I was attempting to play Destiny Hero Plasma Turbo, where it's like I ran like 3 Destiny Hero Plasma Grinder Golems, things to like generate take tokens and bodies to be able to sack the 3 of to special summon Plasma and just take stuff. Like I love Destiny Hero Plasma. Like I actually really love Plasma. But the thing that I run into is if you're wanting to build something, that's fine, especially in games like Modern Pokemon TCG. Like, if you want to build something like, I don't know. I was talking with a buddy recently. We were talking about like Tyranitar EX because it has like this double colorless that like it does like X times the amount of energy attached to it. So like run like Baxcalibur Water Energy Turbo with like Tyranitar EX could be kind of silly, could be kind of funny. Kind of want to buy it once we get some like Tyranitar EX full arts, because I think there's only reverse foils. I don't think there's actually full arts of it, unfortunately. But you can bring something like that. You can bring like Galissapod EX, like nothing's stopping you. I remember I was playing Shaman EX was still legal at the time I was playing. I think this was like I think like early Sun and Moon. Yeah, I brought like Shaman EX as support because Shaman EX was a very good supporter in the Pokemon TCG. Shaman EX like Galissapod EX Alola Ninetales. Like, I brought this really jank deck, and the whole thing was like smash with Galissapod, and then you like get the retreat out into like the Alola Ninetales, which was like supposed to give you a little bit of protection. This was base. I think that I ran like 2 EX GX. I ran like 2 Alola Ninetale GX, but I ran like the 4 Vulpix line. I think it was like a 4 Vulpix, 2 EX, 2 regular, because like Aurora Veil just prevented like EX and GX from doing damage to you or something like that. And like I was able to cheese out a couple games just because I was able to like we didn't have boss's orders at the time. We had like, I think we had like Lysander's trump card had like rotated at that point, but we had things like catchers in format, right? Sorry, I've played a lot of games. Yeah, I love talking about games and game design. I actually really love competitive gaming. Like that is a big one that I love. But yeah, you run into where you can bring stuff, but sometimes you have to understand that a deck would function better if or something would function better if the format was just slower, right? Like if the format wasn't so hyper fast in, say, competitive Pokemon, Wobbuffet would see less play. Like we have an actual correlation between how offensive a format is and Wobbuffet actually picking up knockouts, right? If a format was slower, we might see a lot more things like Solgaleo. We might see a lot more things like Reshiram. If it was a slower format, I would argue defensive walls like Lugia and Ho-Oh would probably see a lot more play as well. I mean, we did have Gen 2 GSE, which was a very tanky format in itself. So I think that could be used as a like how tanky formats in Pokemon could work, specifically from a singles standpoint. But yeah, and even then, like just it's understanding the game, right? Like meta games develop because the meta is one of the quickest ways, or the de facto quickest way in a tier 0 format of achieving the end goal. What's the end goal? Knocking out your opponent's 4 to 6 Pokemon. Okay, if that's the case, have you considered Kyurem White? Have you considered Wobbuffet that's able to like counter Miracle Destiny Bond shenanigans, right? Like you're not necessarily running something like Sunkern for all intents and purposes, is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, like the knowing what's in the format, knowing the speed of the format, are crucial to understanding games at a competitive level, but that shouldn't ever disqualify someone from at least trying, right? Like that's why we get metagame shakeups. That's why we get underdog status. That's why we get like, Sage and Park showing up with his Pachirisu, because like there's a thing in the metagame that this solves. Cool, we're gonna do this, and then it proceeds to like win worlds, right? Like there's always, just because something is meta or just because there is a meta doesn't necessarily mean that other things can't come in and try to buck that status quo. And I think that's why I like competitive gaming, because that is possible for skilled players. This bug, yeah.
Not all Arceus forms are created equal, of course, but we're singling out Bug for a reason. It has received clamoring on more than one occasion, in more than one generation, to be tested in OU. Yes, blasphemous though it may seem, the god of Pokemon's pestilent form does not command sufficient reverence or fear to prevent such heretic ideas from disseminating. Nothing came of them, of course, as more reasonable heads prevailed in convincing those apostates that even Arceus' lowliest form would smite standard play with ease, but it does demonstrate that even the great all-creator is not exempt from such debasing distinctions as to land it on this list. When you think of monotyping, Bug hardly seems like the worst. Yes, it's flawed, but it also has several advantages. It resists significant attacking types like fighting, ground, and grass. With Stab, it hits dangerous psychic and dark types super effectively. On a good Pokemon, let alone one of Arceus' stature, it feels like you could do a lot worse, especially when your options are every other type out there. So why is Bug...
This feels so weird every time, because I play mostly VGC, right? And have played mostly VGC. I've played maybe 2 games using Smogon format. It's always weird to me to see things like Darkrai and Arceus just on board, because they're mythical Pokemon. I think the current modern term is like event Pokemon, quote unquote. But you don't see them in VGC. You will never see a Jirachi in VGC. You will never see a Manaphy in VGC. You will never see an Arceus in VGC. That's just because of what they are. I think that has to do with potentially missing it. I don't even think I have what's not Volcarona. Volcarona is the bug. Volcanion, is that the one? Yeah, because I completely was out of the game. I was like really deep into like work, like actual like first job status when a lot of that started rolling around. So I definitely missed things like Volcanion. I definitely missed things like Meloetta and stuff. which I'm trying to go back and see if, like, I don't know, I'm going back, seeing what I can and can't get in older games. Like, it's just so weird to see just these absolute titans just hashing it out. It's so strange to me.
Bugs so singled out as the worst. Well, it's basically the combination of the lowest upsides and the highest downsides. There are other flawed typings to be sure. One's mind generally jumps to ice, for instance, but as bad as ice is defensively, it is also tremendously gifted offensively. One might also think of other unspectacular typings like, say, mono poison, but that one has the nice resist without much in the way of truly crippling weaknesses, as well as some nice bonuses like a toxic immunity and even the ability to absorb toxic spikes. Bug has the worst of both worlds. There are other Stealth Rock weak Arceus forms, of course, but in addition to the aforementioned ice, there's also the offensively dangerous fire and flying, which is well-rounded once you get past the rocks issues, including the nice bonus of being spikes immune. When you look at successful bug types, they generally have useful rock-resistant secondary typings to help them get the most of the bug's resist without being as dragged down by Stealth Rock, as well as bolstering it with further resist. See Buzzwole, which packs those fighting ground and grass resist, and is renowned for its defensive utility, but that's also because of its half-fighting typing, which offsets Stealth Rock and gives it a wonderful dark resist to boot. Or Scizor, who loses the ground and fighting resist, but makes up for it with not just Stealth Rock neutrality, but the many defensive benefits of Steel, including resist to Dragon, Ice, and Fairy. Their secondary stabs make them far more threatening in return too, as is also the case for more out-and-out offensively minded bugs like Heracross, Pheromosa, and Genesect too. Arceus is never going to be outright bad because it's Arceus, but it's not getting the most of its potential as a bug type. Just the opposite. Offensively, defensively, it's as mediocre as Arceus is gonna get, which has earned it the position as one of the worst Ubers.
I think that's super interesting to hear Arceus bug not really doing anything. But then, I mean, we've talked about how, like, the bug type renaissance kind of took place in Gen 5, right? Like, bug type's been around since RBY. It's been around since Generation 1. And, well, in Gen 1, it was, like, the only way that you could potentially try to hit, like, actual, like, psychic types for super effective damage because Ghost was bugged in Gen 1. So, it's interesting to look at. It really is. Because bug type has always kind of had a leg up on certain things. I mean, that'd be like being resistant to ground, right? Like if you're resisting earthquake, like you already have some sort of value. Like you already have a value proposition on you. And we have like one of the like best competitive moves in the game, especially in singles, is U-turn, is it not? To be able to abuse your speed stat, being faster than your opponent, to whack your opponent for damage, even if it's not stab or super effective, and then be able to reposition into another Pokemon. So, for example, if you have a Mewtwo firing off like a Psystrike at you, and you use you U-turn it, and you're faster than it, you not only hit it non-stab super effective damage, but then you swap out to something like a Yveltal, and then suddenly the Psystrike just doesn't even affect you, right? Like that's a huge thing for competitive Pokemon, being able to reposition like that. So like clearly bug type has a usage, but it's interesting to look at like, because specifically Arceus has actual type bug, there's just better types, right? Now, like let's go with the Mewtwo example. If you're staring down a Mewtwo and it's going to Psystrike you, right? Like closed information, right? Well, open information, closed system, right? It's going to Psystrike against you. Would you much rather have Arceus pronunciation Arceus, my god. Would you rather just have Arceus Bug, or would you rather have Arceus Dark at that point? Because Dark would, for all intents and purposes, be not be affected by that Psystrike, right? Like, but you see that it's not that it's necessarily bad because it's Arceus, right? Like, it's not bad because it has name Arceus. It's just not as good as other things. Ice is, yes, a bad typing when it comes to being defensive. It has a lot of weaknesses, but Ice also hits really hard. Ice also deals with name Landorus or name Landorus Therian, right? Like, big Ice does hit some pretty big threats. It's super effective against Dragon. It's super effective against ground. It's super effective against flying, right? Like, if you're able to override Mega Rayquaza's, it's not Howling Winds, whatever Mega Rayquaza's ability is, right? So it's not reducing damage, you're still hitting like 4x on it, right? So I don't know. Let's say you swap in like Primordial Kyogre. You swap in like Kyogre, and then you like Primal Revert Kyogre into Primal Kyogre, and then you fire off like, I don't know, an Ice Beam or a Blizzard at Mega Rayquaza, you're hitting at 4x. Like, Ice is very, very good offensively, and that's why we see Pokemon that are super defensive Ice type wise, not do super well. But we have Pokemon like Weavile, and we have Pokemon like Chien-Pao, who are just absolutely just doing numbers. Alolan Ninetales, for all intents and purposes, able to Snow Warning, able to set up its own Blizzard and then fire off. Set up its own Hail going into Scarlet and Violet, now Snow, and be able to fire off one after the other, Blizzard, right? 5 turns. You can set up Aurora Veil. I mean, there's variants that definitely Choice Specs and or Choice Scarf it. I mean, that's where player preference comes into play. It depends on what you're doing. Like, Ice is bad from a strictly defensive standpoint, but if you're trying to knock things out, and especially if you're like looking at things like Name Yveltal, and you're trying to just like, I want that gone, it's not a bad way to go about it. So, just things to think about, right? It's not, he's correct. It's not bad because name Arceus. It's bad because it's just not as good as other things, right? Like, you came in 3rd place in a competition despite places 1 through 3 all having just like phenomenal whatever they submitted or whatever they were testing for, right? It's not that you're awful. It's just that places 1 and 2 just did better. Course.
We're restricting this to an honorable mention because it is very, very self-evident, as well as a rehash of the Solgaleo concept, but it's worth a quick glance at specifically because of how obvious it is. Calyrex Shadow is an unbelievably dangerous Pokemon, being the defining threat in Gen 8 and getting banned in Gen 9, and Spectreer's main contribution to Ubers is allowing Calyrex to fuse with it. Obviously, it's fully outclassed in Gen 8, but even when there's no Calyrex S around to outclass it in Gen 9, Spectreer doesn't have anything worth doing. It's just not quite up to snuff with Ubers' standards of power, speed, and even bulk.
Yeah. I mean, why are you just not running Calyrex Shadow Rider? They take up the same slot. They take up that special Pokemon slot, that legendary slot. Why would you not run something like Flutter Mane, which can also hit for Fairy Weakness, right? Because it's Fairy Ghost. Why would you just not run like Flutter Mane and instead just run Horse? Because you're freeing up your special slot, that legendary slot, for something else. And you're also still running a super good special attacker that's Ghost. Now, obviously, I think there's people that can make an argument for it. I think that, well, not specifically Flutter Mane, but something like, I don't know, maybe Dragapult, because Dragapult is like Ghost Dragon, and it hits on the physical side of things rather than the special side of things, and also doesn't take up a Legend slot, right? Like, if you're taking up Legend slot, what is your value proposition? What do you give me? Are you better than something like Landorus Therian, right? If you're not better than Landorus Therian, like, why are you taking up my Legend slot? It's why I consistently run into issues trying to build Rayquaza for VGC, because it feels like there's just better options. Like, Airlock doesn't really, talking normal Rayquaza, doesn't really further its game state. It's more reactive rather than proactive, where, yes, you can, use something like Drizzle from Kyogre or use something like Drought from Groudon, and that's able to set weather and or deny weather. So your opponent's running Kyogre, you swap in Groudon while your Venusaur or whatever tries to go for like a Solar Beam or Solar Blade, right, to try and hit that Kyogre that may be Choice Spec locked into Water Spout at that point, right? And you can just deny it the water. You can just deny. But generally, if you're gonna be like, okay, well, because I run this in Sword and Shield Battle Tower all the time, right? Run Prankster, Tailwind, Whimsicott, Choice Specs, Kyogre, right? Kyogre switches in. I will Tailwind with the Whimsicott, doubling my speed. And then I have Choice Specs, Water Spout, also Drizzle and Stab boosted to just nuke whatever's on the field. And oh darn, I don't nuke everything. Cool. Then I swap something in. Like, that's why the Zacian core was like super popular, like Kyogre and Zacian. That was a very strong core. Is it unbeatable? No. Good players can be able to play around it, but it is a very good value for what you get. So, yeah. Yeah, look at those value propositions. Like, what do you offer me? What, especially when you're using like your deck building slots of like, okay, like, or your video game slots where like I can only run so much of this. What do you add to my build? How do I justify your existence? Is something that you need to ask. And if the answer is you should just run Calyrex Shadow Rider because one ability is effectively two abilities, which is huge power creep in my opinion, like, yeah, one of these might just be better. You might as well just find something else to fill that ghost slot because free up that legend slot. Okay.
Zamazenta Crown rounds out this list because it's not just a box legend. It is a powered up form of a box legend. It's a little slower than its base counterpart, which of course fell to OU in Gen 9, thereby disqualifying it from this video that it absolutely would have been part of had we made it in Gen 8. But Zamazenta Crown is all about the bulk, and it is much tankier, jumping from base 115 defenses to base 145 in Gen 8 and 140 after being nerfed in Gen 9. Additionally, Dauntless Shield
I didn't even know it got nerfed.
Boosts its defense every time it comes in Gen 8, meaning it eats all manner of physical hits for breakfast without even trying, allowing it to focus on bulking out its hefty special defense as well, making it rather impenetrable on both sides of the spectrum. The +1 defense boost is a one-time deal in Gen 9, but Zamazenta Crown is still an impressive hit taker, especially with the many resists afforded by its typing. Think Cobalion's physically tanky heroics across many generations of lower tiers, but a million times better in all aspects of its game. So, why is Zamazenta Crown so unimpressive as to have been suggested to follow its base form into OU, even after Gen 9 gave it body press? The main issue is that Zamazenta Crown is a defensive Pokemon that doesn't offer much in return. It hits quite well for a defensive Pokemon, but it's the utility that's lacking. Any decent team can handle stab hits from defensive pokes. Outside its stabs, Zamazenta Crown has very little to offer. Basically, it's what every defensive Pokemon hopes to avoid. It is passive. It being so unthreatening makes it a cinch to take advantage of. Every defensive Pokemon has their exploitable points, of course, but they generally have tools to make it difficult to do so, like phasing, knockoff, entry hazards, leech seed, but all Zamazenta has are its stabs. As if this wasn't bad enough, it has to rely on rest for recovery, an unpleasant necessity whose negatives are amplified by Zamazenta's lack of leftovers, meaning it's provoked into forced use of the move far more quickly than it'd like. The overall effect is a rather bland wall that doesn't leave much impact on the game and is generally not worth the team slot. It also sure doesn't help that, cool as its typing is, it's generally not that helpful against Ubers' biggest and strongest. It's a great answer to Kyurem Black, but so is the amazing Necrozma Duskmane. It had these issues even if it hadn't been nerfed in Gen 9, but that certainly didn't help. It's a shame, but Zamazenta Crown got the seriously raw end of the deal as far as Gen 8's box legends were concerned.
Yeah, I could see that. So, I mean, this runs into the effect that we keep talking. I'm actually curious, because we talked about Deoxys defense a little bit earlier on in the video. I wonder if you can draw comparisons between Zamazenta Crowned as well as Deoxys defense. I think there could be an interesting analysis done there. Deoxys also actually being one of those event quote-unquote mythical Pokemon that you would never see in VGC. So, right, how do you progress your game state, right? Well, my game state is going, and I had the wrong philosophy going into Sword and Shield. I thought Zacian was going to be worse because Zamazenta would have inherent protection going in with that +1. But being able to play and being able to witness, my philosophy has kind of evolved in a way where, yeah, as it turns out, you don't have to worry about taking damage if your opponent is just knocked out, right? Like sometimes hyper aggression is the answer. Sometimes being able to go deep like that is the answer. And then obviously I feel like Zacian Crown just effectively won in regards to at least between him and Zamazenta for Sword and Shield. So, yeah, I mean, being only locked in, you're locked out of your item because to even get to Zamazenta shield form, right? You have to have that rusted shield on. You forego your item slot. So you can't have leftovers, you can't have Chesto Berry, you can't have Shell Bell. You are locked into that. And well, what if we take the rusted shield off and gave it something like a choice band or like a choice scarf? Well, then that's not what we're specifically talking about, right? We're talking about specifically Zamazenta Crown, right? Like we're talking about like big boy Zamazenta. So I think that's interesting. Like, what do you do to further your game state? I boost and then I try to hit with stab. Okay. So is that tempo going to be faster than your opponent trying to knock you out, right? So let's look at this example right here. You have a Mewtwo, right? Let's say you have a Mewtwo with like, I don't know, like choice specs Psy Strike, right? And let's say for some reason the calculation rounds out that could be a one-hit KO. Let's give him benefit of the doubt. Let's say it's hyper like special defensive vest. Let's say it's a guaranteed 2-hit KO, right? What do you do to that Mewtwo if it is a 2-hit KO? Like, what do you do? Well, I can try to attack, but you don't have the boost. You don't have the move slots to be able to deal with it effectively, right? Like, okay, well, if you wanted to scale off of, say, that defense, you have to use like a body press and maybe fire off a body press. Like, okay, Mewtwo resists that, even if it's a Pokemon that didn't resist it, right? Let's still say it's a Pokemon that like clean 2-hit KOs Zamazenta, because you know it's attacking with the special side, but it's weak to say something like body press, right? Are you still going to be able to fire off like 1 to 2 body presses, even if you're using rest before it knocks you out, right? Like, you see how you're analyzing this and you're fighting this uphill battle, right? Like, in certain matchups, yeah, I feel like you can start off super strong. But if it turns into, well, it's the restaurant effect. You're having to escort the payload, right? You're having to escort the payload to be able to play the game, right? And if you can't escort the payload into the game properly, is that just not a detriment to your team at that point? Like, and then you have to question, why are you running Zamazenta, right? Why are you specifically running this Zamazenta? Well, I want to run it because it is a physically defensive wall. Have you tried something like Amogus, which is meant to take hits? It has things like Rage Powder. It has things like Spore. Has some sustainability. I think it gets access to Leech Seed, Substitute. Have you tried that? It also doesn't take up your legend slot, right? Legends, once again, are not all created equal. What is the value proposition you would get out of Zamazenta for taking up that legend slot, for taking up that crucial limited resource? So I like this. I like that analysis.
And that's it. Of course, these are far from the only Pokemon of their kind, so we're sure to revisit the subject in the future. Let us know which you'd like to explore. Sometimes this kind of thing is generational. For instance, Cinderace was only Uber in one generation, and it was utterly terrible. It also isn't a legendary, unlike all those others. We could also consider Ubers that fell off, like Darkrai and Genesect. Either way, we look forward to what you have to say and to explore the lower end of the wonderful Ubers metagame once again. Thanks for watching, everyone. And as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos. And thank you to everyone else watching as well.
I don't even think that Darkrai was necessarily his own fault. I feel like, because like Fairy type came out, but Dark Void also got nerfed literally because of Smeargle. Because Smeargle using it in VGC. So I don't think that's necessarily Darkrai's fault. So I'd have to look more into that.
And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Dr. Mint, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Nurse Jake, Jack G, Lord of the Rabbit, Pretzel SP, Raven Daytona Ring, Ray Ray, Skylaria, Soares and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, and Quetzalcoatl Northropi for their major support of our videos.
Love that last name. That's so cool. What a cool name.
And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.
I always forget he has a Twitch account. I'll have to go follow him on there. I don't know how I turned this video into 57 minutes. I think we can argue I was transformative in at least a little capacity. So I loved it. I love what his team put together. I love that, I mean, Wolfie VGC even cites him, right? Like, I think he's really got a good thing going on. I think that False Light Gaming is just really, really good when you consider that, competitive Pokemon can be daunting for a lot of people. And I'm glad that that gap is able to be kind of short up a little bit. I mean, you can go into a False Fight Gaming video. Sure, you can be overwhelmed at some points, but just that's a lot of information coming at you. But it's a lot of good information, right? Just be able to understand what information you're looking for, how to sift through the information, and ultimately, if you're new to competitive Pokemon, like don't feel the need to dive super deep, right? If you want to use Zamazenta, use Zamazenta, right? If you want to use something like Mewtwo, if you want to use Solgaleo, there's nothing that prevents you from using that. Go for it. When these conversations are specifically geared at the competitive standpoint, at the competitive level, and competitive gaming kind of gears itself in its own unique way, such as competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, right? The best quote I've ever heard is competitive Yu-Gi-Oh is a very silly place, which it for all intents and purposes is. And it's okay to just play games casually. I know that's such a hot take to have, but it's fine. And there's plenty of good resources like False Light Gaming, like Wolfie VGC, and this is some quality work. I'm very curious if you know what that PC case was. Definitely let me know what that was, because I might be looking at that in the next few years. Might be looking at upgrading PC to new PC. I'm gonna wait for like the 60 series to come out and see about that. Anyways, that's down the line. Thank you, False Light Gaming. Thank you, False Light Gaming team, for putting together such an absolute, just awesome video. Sorry if I ruined it for a lot of people. I'm trying to keep these under an hour. I don't know how this is over 40 minutes to begin with, but thank you everyone. I really do appreciate it. And I'll see you in the next one.